Hey chocolate friends, Carla with Opening Chocolate here, and today I had a video that I didn't know how to categorize. I didn't know whether to put this as a bar bits or, because it's not really a company video, but I'm going to talk about a place. So I'm going to talk about today Sao Tome. And here's a letterpress made with Sao Tome beans, and I have this one too from Zotter, made with Sao Tome beans, and that's why I want to talk about this. So I want to talk about it so you know about it, because these are some little islands with some great big history behind them, and they are popping up more and more in chocolate bars now again. And so I thought you may be able to use this in a tasting if you were using any of these bars or any other bars made with Sao Tome beans. A lot of interesting information. So I'm a little bit, don't know how to categorize this. It's not going to be short. I got a lot to say, but it's not on a company. So let's start. So the official name of the country is the Democratic Republic of Sao Tome and Príncipe. Sometimes they're nicknamed the Chocolate Islands. They are tiny islands off the coast of in the Gulf of Guinea, off the western coast of equatorial Africa. Tiny, tiny islands. They're only like 50 kilometers by 30 kilometers is Sao Tome, and Príncipe is even smaller than that. They have a population of around 200,000 total. Sao Tome has more people than Príncipe. Príncipe only has about 9,000 in the last census. They are the second smallest sovereign state in Africa. The first is the Seychelles, in case you were wondering. They are about 140 kilometers apart, tiny islands. There's a bunch of little uninhabited islets in there too, but it's mostly the two main islands. So these islands, although small, have big history, both overall in the world and for chocolate. So they may have been the first place in Africa to grow cacao. But initially, the islands were allegedly uninhabited when the Portuguese came upon them around the late 15th century, 1470-ish, they landed. And they colonized the Portuguese colonized the islands in the 16th century. So they began to settle them by granting land from the Portuguese crown, but most people didn't want to go there, so they were mostly settled by what would be categorized then as undesirables, so things like convicts or Jewish people. But by 1550, it had become a major slave depot. So it played an integral role in the Atlantic slave trade. So it was kind of like a stopping point: Africa, the islands, and then the Caribbean and Brazil and all over on the other side of the Atlantic. So it was the stopping point in the slave trade that went across the Atlantic. It was really hard to keep people on the islands because there was a lot of disease and there was a lot of food shortages. Even today, 90% of the food that they have on the islands is imported. But initially, because they're these beautiful volcanic islands with these lovely volcanic soil, equatorial ecosystems, so great for the cash crops like sugar, coffee, cacao. The first ones that came up were the sugar plantations and the sugar mills. They got big in the 16th century. And then because of slave revolts and what was happening across the Atlantic, the sugar plantations were becoming really big across the Atlantic. So the sugar cultivation went down, and the slave trade then dominated beginning in the 17th century. So it was, again, there was revolts happening, and it was hard to keep people on these islands because it was just a hard place to live, hard to stay alive. And so they had some interesting things happen. The didn't happen until centuries later in other places. Like, they supported interracial marriages. If you were a white settler and married an African wife, your African wife was released from slavery. Slaves that arrived early were freed. People of mixed race were allowed to own property and also run and hold public office. So they had a lot of, although there was the slave trade there was some unique situations that occurred on the island to keep people there that didn't occur in other places in the world until much later. So in 1761, Portugal banned slavery in Portugal, but they didn't officially ban it in their colonies until 1876. So we're coming up let me back up a little bit. Starting in the early 19th century, you have other cash crops taking over the island. So you have coffee becoming big, you have cocoa becoming big, and you have these huge plantations being formed. And on the islands they're called, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Rosas. So there were these big plantations that were basically run on slave labor. Now, one of the things that has to do with Sao Tome and chocolate, specifically in some chocolate companies, is Cadbury, at the turn of the century from the 1800s to the 1900s, Cadbury became embroiled in this slavery controversy because at the time, England was working to outlaw slavery in other places in the world. Cadbury was founded by Quakers who had they want more equality than was at the time, not necessarily equal equality. There's still very much patriarchal sense to it, but they were very much against slave labor in theory. And when people were saying in the late 1800s, Cadbury's, you're still getting your chocolate from this cocoa from your slave laborers in Africa, and Cadbury's like, no, we don't think we are. And so there was this big controversy, and if you want to read more about it, I would recommend this book by Deborah Cadbury. It's called The Chocolate Wars. It's really interesting history of Cadbury, and it talks about this was a big deal. This went to the British government, got involved, and the Portuguese government got involved, and it was a really big deal at the time. Cadbury was saying, no, we don't have slave labor. Let's send this guy down there and we'll take a look. And that took 3 years and dragged on and on. And as they benefited economically from it, and they're like, no, there's no slave labor, then they sent a relative down, and the relative came back and said, yes, there is slave labor. And there was a scientific American article in 1897 that documented the slave labor. So it was all this big thing where corporations were taking economic advantage of a situation. So these tiny islands became embroiled in this big economic controversy at the turn of the century from the 1800s to the 1900s. So when slavery was officially abolished, although it wasn't really abolished. So we had these huge cocoa plantations called the Rosas, and they developed a new kind of labor, a new system of labor called serviços. Free on paper, but in reality, it was basically just another word for slave labor. So what it was where they were supposed to work for a specific amount of time on the Rosas, usually 5 years, and then they were supposed to be able to leave. They were supposed to be able to repatriate. And there was estimated between 20 and 40,000 people living as serviços, or in this slave labor situation, not called slave labor. But what happened was they would get to the end of their contract and the plantation owner would renew the contract without any input from the individual who's doing the work. So congratulations, you made it 5 years, you're free. Oh, except we renewed your contract, so you still have to work for us. And also the children of the cervisas became property of the plantation owners. How that is not slave labor, I don't know, but it is slave labor. So there was a big deal. And at that time, 18 to 1900s, right as the turn of the century, Sao Tome was, if not the world's largest producer of cacao, it was up there. They were one of the largest producers of cacao. And Cadbury's was in with the scandal, and finally Cadbury's said, yes, this is happening. We won't buy cacao from them anymore. And that kind of led to a downfall throughout the 1900s where there was a lot of economic unrest, there was a lot of social unrest, a lot of the plantations just collapsed without the viability of the slave labor model that they were exploiting. So it just kind of became a mess. So actually right now it's interesting because almost all of the citizens are descendants of people that were taken to the islands by the Portuguese after 1470. So in 1975, they had a peaceful independence from Portugal, and many of the Rosas were nationalized, and so they just fell into collapse after 1975 and 1980s, 1990s. Economic factors pretty much led to the complete collapse of the cocoa industry, cocoa production in Sao Tome and Príncipe. So they went from producing the most to producing next to none. If you were to visit the islands, you can see all these plantations. There's hundreds of dilapidated plantations with these structures, architectural structures that are interesting to look at and a good reminder of the history of the islands. So Sao Tome, obviously because I have cocoa, I have chocolate made with Sao Tome, is making somewhat of a comeback in the cocoa production area. Kind of started with Claudio Corallo. He's an Italian-born expat who lived in Africa for a long time, running plantations, moved to Sao Tome to start up cocoa and coffee plantations. He has a Rosas Terreiro Velha on Príncipe. He converts it to beach bar in his factory in São Tomé. It's a little bit difficult to get his chocolate, but you can get it. And as far as I know, he is still making it. Recently, there is another investor, an IT billionaire, Mark Shuttleworth. What did Mark do to get rich? He wrote a Linux operating system that is embedded in all kinds of electronics, drones. It's in the internet. It's in thermostats. It's a kind of behind the scenes operating system that most consumers don't know about, but is in a lot of electronics. So he recently opened a resort and has been investing in eco-agroforestry. Some people are happy about that, some are not. What else can I tell you? If you want to read some interesting history, look into Sao Tome and Príncipe. Really super interesting just on their own, but also interesting for the cocoa industry. So the cocoa that you get, and I haven't opened these, and I'm not going to open them today because I've already talked for too long. The cocoa that you get is a descendant of amelanados or forasteros out of Brazil. They tend to have nice chocolatey undertones: cocoa, red fruit, yellow fruit, apricot, citrus, tea. They can be nice and complex chocolate. They can be nice cacao done right. So that's Sao Tome and Príncipe, these tiny islands in the Atlantic Ocean that have such a big, big history when it comes to world economics and cocoa production. So I hope you can use some of that in your chocolate tastings if you're ever are tasting a bar made with Sao Tome cocoa, or you found that interesting. Hey, I've never visited Sao Tome. I'd love to go there when the world is normal again. If you've been to Sao Tome, let me know. Or if you have other questions, or if you know some fun, interesting fact that you'd like to tell me about, be sure to let me know in the comments. Otherwise, subscribe so that I will see you next time and we can talk more chocolate. See you then.